Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the people we least expect. Sometimes a single act of kindness changes everything we thought we knew. Darius Holt built his tech empire by keeping people at arm's length, measuring worth in profit margins. But when a vicious snowstorm traps him in a small-town diner with 15 leather-clad bikers, his controlled world collides with raw humanity. Against every business instinct, he opens his mountain estate to these strangers. What he discovers in those storm-bound hours will shatter everything he believed about success and the men society has forgotten. When dawn breaks and 100 motorcycles arrive in silent tribute, what did these veterans teach a man who thought he had all the answers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Bentley's heated seats couldn't warm the cold that had settled in Darius Holt's chest during the 3-day board retreat. At 57, he'd learned to recognize the particular emptiness that followed these corporate gatherings, the hollow sensation of being surrounded by people yet feeling utterly alone. The retreat had been another exercise in performance, where he'd delivered quarterly projections with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, while board members nodded appreciatively at his latest acquisition strategy. Through the windshield, the Colorado mountains stretched endlessly under a darkening sky, their peaks disappearing into ominous clouds that had been building since he'd left the resort. The weather forecast had mentioned possible snow, but Darius had dismissed it the way he dismissed most inconveniences, as something money and technology could overcome. His Tesla's autopilot could handle mountain roads, and if needed he could always helicopter out from his estate 40 miles ahead. The platinum Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the dashboard's glow as he checked the time. Patricia would be expecting his call in 30 minutes, not from warmth or affection, but because their marriage ran on schedules as rigid as any corporate contract. 23 years of marriage had taught them both that efficiency trumped intimacy. She managed their social obligations, he managed their wealth, and they coexisted in their Denver penthouse like well-dressed strangers sharing premium real estate. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Tomorrow's board call. Move to 8 a.m. Merger documents need your signature by noon. Even in the wilderness, the machinery of his empire demanded attention. Darius had built Holt Tech from a garage startup into a billion-dollar force that reshaped how Fortune 500 companies managed their workforce. His algorithms could predict employee performance, optimize productivity, and streamline operations with ruthless efficiency. He'd revolutionized human resources by removing the human element entirely. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of managing people had somehow forgotten how to connect with them. His son Marcus lived in Seattle, their conversations limited to holiday pleasantries and awkward birthday calls. His daughter Sarah had inherited his analytical mind, but none of his ambition, choosing non-profit work over the corporate ladder he'd built for her. They spoke even less frequently. Snow began falling in earnest as the Tesla navigated a particularly winding stretch of highway. What had started as scattered flakes quickly intensified into a wall of white that overwhelmed the car's sensors. The autopilot disengaged with a soft chime, forcing Darius to grip the steering wheel manually for the first time in months. The familiar weight of control felt foreign in his hands. The storm arrived with mountain fury, transforming the highway into a treacherous ribbon of ice and snow. Visibility dropped to mere yards as wind howled through the canyon walls. Darius found himself leaning forward, squinting through the chaos, his usual confidence replaced by something he rarely experienced: genuine concern. The Tesla's all-wheel drive struggled against accumulating snow, and the heated windshield couldn't keep pace with the blizzard's intensity. A weathered sign appeared in his headlights: Miller's Crossing Food and Fuel, 2 miles. He'd driven this route dozens of times to his mountain estate, but had never stopped in the small town. It existed in his peripheral vision like so many places he passed without seeing, functional but irrelevant to his carefully curated life. Tonight, however, Miller's Crossing represented salvation. The Tesla crawled down the exit ramp, tires fighting for purchase on snow-slicked asphalt. The town materialized from the storm like something from another era, a handful of buildings, clustered around a single main street, their windows glowing warmly against the hostile night. A gas station with vintage pumps sat next to a hardware store that looked unchanged since the 1950s. At the street's heart stood a diner, its neon sign barely visible through the swirling snow, but promising hot coffee and home cooking 24 hours. Darius had eaten in restaurants where meals cost more than most people's weekly salary, but he'd never been inside a place like this. His world consisted of corporate dining rooms, exclusive clubs, and carefully orchestrated business meals where every detail served a strategic purpose. The thought of sitting in a small-town diner felt as foreign as landing on an alien planet. But the storm made choices for him. The Tesla's range was dropping rapidly in the cold, and the estate was still 20 miles away through increasingly dangerous terrain. He pulled into the diner's small parking lot, noting the collection of pickup trucks and aging sedans already gathered there. Other travelers, he assumed, seeking the same refuge from nature's indifference. The wind hit him like a physical blow as he stepped from the car, cutting through his expensive wool coat as if it were tissue paper. Snow immediately began accumulating on his Italian leather shoes, and he hurried toward the diner's entrance, unused to feeling vulnerable to something as basic as weather. The diner's interior assaulted his senses with unfamiliar warmth and chaos. Country music played from a jukebox in the corner, while conversations created a steady hum of human activity. The air smelled of coffee, fried food, and something else he couldn't identify. The scent of people who worked with their hands, lived without financial buffers, and found comfort in simple pleasures he'd long forgotten. Behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and knowing eyes surveyed the growing crowd with practiced efficiency. Her name tag read Betty, and she moved with the confident grace of someone who'd spent decades reading people and situations. She glanced at Darius's expensive clothes and designer watch with the amused recognition of someone accustomed to seeing all types of humanity pass through her establishment. "Coffee, hon?" she asked without preamble, already reaching for a cup. "Looks like you picked a hell of a night to be out on the road." Darius nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. The ceramic mug was chipped but clean, the coffee stronger and more bitter than his usual fair trade blend. It tasted like honesty in a way that surprised him. He found an empty booth near the window and settled in to wait out the storm, pulling out his phone to catch up on emails, but concentration proved elusive. The diner's rhythm was hypnotic in its simplicity. Orders called out, plates delivered, conversations flowing between strangers who seemed to accept each other's presence. Without judgment or calculation, a young mother fed her toddler while reading a paperback novel. An elderly couple shared a piece of pie with the intimacy of people who'd weathered 50 years of storms together. Two men in work clothes discussed fishing plans for the weekend. With the enthusiasm of children planning an adventure, this was life, Darius realized. Not the carefully orchestrated performance he'd mastered, but the messy, unpredictable, deeply human experience he'd optimized out of his existence. These people found meaning in connections he'd algorithmically eliminated as inefficient variables. They invested time in relationships that didn't appear on any balance sheet, but somehow created wealth he'd never learned to measure. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind had increased, rattling the diner's windows. With increasing violence, the weather reports on Betty's radio spoke of unprecedented snowfall and dangerous conditions that would persist through the night. Roads were closing throughout the region, and authorities were advising all travelers to seek immediate shelter. Darius glanced at his watch again, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. But for the first time in years, time felt fluid rather than segmented. He had nowhere urgent to be, no meetings to optimize, no efficiency to maximize. The storm had stripped away his usual controls and left him with something he'd almost forgotten how to experience: the present moment. The diner's door opened with a blast of cold air and snow, admitting a group that immediately changed the atmosphere. 15 men in leather jackets filed in, their boots heavy on the worn linoleum, their presence commanding attention without seeking it. They moved with the quiet discipline of people accustomed to both brotherhood and scrutiny, their weathered faces telling stories of roads traveled and hardships endured. These were the bikers, the men who would, in the hours to come, teach a successful CEO what he'd lost in his climb to the top of a mountain that suddenly seemed very small indeed. The silence that followed their entrance was thick enough to cut. Conversations died mid-sentence as every head in the diner turned to assess the newcomers. Darius watched the transformation ripple through the space. Defensive postures, protective glances toward children, hands moving subtly toward purses and wallets. The warm community atmosphere that had enveloped him moments before evaporated like steam from his coffee cup. The bikers stood just inside the doorway, snow melting from their leather jackets onto the worn linoleum. They weren't the Hollywood caricature Darius had expected. No chains, no visible weapons, no aggressive posturing. Instead, they carried themselves with the quiet dignity of men who'd earned their respect through actions rather than intimidation. Their leader, a tall black man with graying temples and intelligent eyes, surveyed the room with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to hostile receptions. Betty's demeanor shifted like a drawbridge being raised, the warmth that had welcomed. Everyone else suddenly cooled into professional distance. She approached the group with obvious reluctance, her earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed anxiety. "We're pretty full up tonight," she announced, though Darius could clearly see empty stools at the counter and several vacant booths. "Might want to try the truck stop about 15 miles down the highway." The lead biker, his jacket bore a patch, reading "Road Captain" above the name Mitchell, nodded with the weary acceptance of a man who'd heard similar rejections countless times. But one of his companions, younger and less patient, stepped forward with obvious frustration. 15 miles in this storm?" he asked, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone pushed past tolerance. "Lady, we can barely see the road in front. Of us, we just need coffee and a place to wait it out, Tommy," Mitchell said quietly, and the younger man immediately stepped back. The single word carried enough authority to diffuse the tension, revealing the disciplined hierarchy within their group. This wasn't a gang, Darius realized, but something closer to a military unit. Betty remained unmoved. "Like I said, we're full. You'll have to find somewhere else." The exchange felt familiar to Darius in the worst possible way. He'd witnessed similar scenes in corporate boardrooms, the polite language that masked exclusion, the reasonable-sounding excuses that disguised prejudice. But he'd never been forced to watch from the outside, to see how efficiently human beings could be othered and dismissed. Around the diner, other patrons studied their plates with sudden fascination, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The elderly couple who'd been sharing pie now sat stiffly, the man's arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. The young mother had pulled her toddler closer, as if proximity to these strangers might somehow contaminate her child. Only the two workers in their booth seemed unbothered, continuing their conversation about weekend fishing plans as if nothing had changed. Mitchell reached into his jacket, a movement that caused several people to tense visibly, and withdrew. A worn leather wallet. "We'll pay cash," he said simply. "Double the usual price, if that helps with the crowding problem." His dignity in the face of rejection struck Darius like a physical blow. Here was a man willing to pay extra for the privilege of basic human courtesy, accepting discrimination with grace while maintaining his group's composure. It was a kind of strength Darius had never needed to develop, protected as he'd been by wealth and status from such everyday humiliations. "It's not about money," Betty replied, though her eyes lingered on the bills in Mitchell's wallet. "It's about keeping our regular customers comfortable." The words hung in the air like a judgment. These men weren't considered worthy of comfort. Despite their quiet respectfulness and obvious need for shelter, they were being turned away not for anything they'd done, but for who they appeared to be. Darius felt something crack inside his chest, not quite his heart breaking, but definitely his certainty about how the world worked. Through the window, the storm had intensified to near whiteout conditions. Snow swirled in hypnotic patterns, while wind howled with increasing ferocity. The parking lot was becoming impassable, buried under drifts that would challenge even the most capable vehicles. Sending these men back onto the highway wasn't just inhospitable, it was potentially deadly. "Ma'am," Mitchell tried one more time, his voice carrying the patient persistence of someone accustomed to advocating for others. "We're not looking for trouble. We're just 15 guys who need to get out of this storm. We'll sit wherever you want, order whatever you've got, and leave as soon as the road's clear." But Betty had made her decision. The fear in her eyes wasn't entirely irrational. She was responsible for everyone in her establishment, and decades of small-town experience had taught her to err on the side of caution. Still, her next words fell like stones into still water. Sorry, but you'll have to go. We can't accommodate your group tonight." Mitchell nodded once, accepting defeat with the grace of a man who'd learned to choose his battles carefully. He turned to his companions, ready to lead them back into the storm, when a voice cut through the tension from an unexpected source. "Wait!" Darius was as surprised as anyone to hear himself speak. The word had emerged without conscious decision, driven by an impulse he couldn't name or rationalize. Every eye in the diner turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention. Like a spotlight he'd never asked for, he stood slowly, his expensive clothes marking him as clearly as the biker's leather had marked them. But where their otherness made them unwelcome, his suggested influence and respectability. The contradiction wasn't lost on him, or on anyone else watching this strange tableau unfold. "I have a place," he heard himself continue, each word surprising him as it emerged. "About 20 miles from here, plenty of room for everyone." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Mitchell studied Darius with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust easy offers from strangers. The other bikers exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. Even Betty stared at Darius as if he'd suddenly sprouted a second head. "That's generous," Mitchell said finally, his tone suggesting he was trying to identify the catch. "But we don't take charity." "It's not charity," Darius replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. "It's just practical. I'm not driving anywhere in this storm either. Might as well wait it out together." The younger biker, Tommy, laughed with bitter amusement. "Right. Rich guy in a suit wants to help a bunch of bikers out of the goodness of his heart. What's the angle, man?" Darius felt heat rise in his cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from recognition. The suspicion was earned. People like him didn't typically extend themselves for people like them without calculating some advantage. But for once in his life, he couldn't identify his own motivation. He was acting on instinct rather than strategy, and the sensation was as terrifying as it was liberating. "No angle," he said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. "Just seems like the right thing to do." Mitchell stepped closer, studying Darius with eyes that had clearly seen enough of life to recognize both sincerity and deception. Whatever he saw in Darius's face seemed to satisfy some internal test, because his posture gradually relaxed. "You sure about this?" Mitchell asked. 15 strangers in your house during a storm. That's a lot of trust to place in people you don't know." Darius looked around the diner at the faces watching this exchange. Some showed curiosity, others disapproval, but most reflected the same calculation he'd been making his entire career. What's in it for me? For the first time in decades, he genuinely didn't know the answer to that question. He was operating without his usual algorithms, making decisions based on something far more primitive and honest than profit optimization. "I'm sure," he said, and meant it completely. Mitchell extended his hand, calloused, strong, bearing the silver dog tags that had somehow worked their way outside his shirt during the confrontation. "Name's Mitchell Torres, road captain for the Iron Brotherhood, and we accept your offer." As Darius shook the man's hand, feeling the genuine strength in his grip, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made the most important business decision of his life. Not because of any financial implications, but because for the first time in years, he'd chosen humanity over efficiency. The storm outside might be unpredictable and dangerous, but the real tempest was just beginning to form in the space between two worlds that had never been meant to meet. The convoy that emerged from the diner parking lot looked like something from a fever dream. Darius's pristine Tesla led a procession of snow-covered Harley-Davidsons through the storm, their headlights cutting feeble paths through the swirling chaos. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. A billionaire, tech mogul leading a motorcycle gang to his mountain estate during a blizzard. His board of directors would have him committed if they could see him now. Mitchell rode directly behind the Tesla, close enough that his headlight filled Darius's rearview mirror with harsh illumination. The other 14 bikers followed in, a tight formation that spoke of practiced coordination and mutual responsibility. They moved through the storm like a pack, protecting their weakest members and maintaining communication through hand signals Darius couldn't decipher, but found oddly comforting. The drive should have taken 20 minutes on a clear day. Tonight, it stretched into an hour-long battle against wind and accumulating snow. The Tesla's sophisticated traction control worked overtime, while Darius gripped the steering wheel with uncharacteristic tension. Behind him, the motorcycles fought even harder against the elements, their riders hunched forward against the bitter wind, utterly exposed to nature's assault. Twice he had to stop when one of the bikes lost traction on a particularly treacherous curve. Each time, the other riders immediately surrounded their fallen comrade, helping lift the heavy machine and checking for injuries with an efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first roadside emergency. Watching them through his side mirrors, Darius was struck by their absolute commitment to each other. No one complained about the delays or suggested leaving someone behind. They were a unit, and units didn't abandon their members. When they finally reached the estate's gates, Darius felt a familiar surge of pride, followed immediately by an unfamiliar stab of embarrassment. The wrought-iron entrance proclaimed his success with subtle arrogance, elegant, expensive, and utterly removed from the struggles most people faced. Motion sensors activated floodlights that illuminated the property's grandeur, even through the storm's fury, revealing manicured landscaping now buried under pristine snow. He fumbled for his key fob, then realized the bikers had no way of knowing. The gates would open automatically. Rolling down his window, he gestured for them to follow, feeling awkward about the entire procedure. How did you welcome people to a home that cost more than most earned in a lifetime? How did you act normal when nothing about your life was normal? The driveway wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, eventually revealing the house itself, a modern architectural marvel of steel, glass, and Colorado stone that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views that on clear days stretched across 3 counties. Tonight, those windows reflected the headlights of 15 motorcycles like some surreal art installation. The garage could accommodate 8 cars, but Darius directed the group to park under the covered portico instead. As engines shut down one by one, an unusual quiet settled over the property, the kind of profound silence that only mountain snowstorms could create. The bikers dismounted stiffly, their movements betraying the toll of riding through such brutal conditions. Mitchell approached the Tesla as Darius climbed out, both men instinctively hunching against the wind. Even with the portico's protection, the cold was sharp enough to cut. "Hell of a place," Mitchell observed, though his tone was neutral. rather than impressed. Appreciate the shelter? Darius found himself studying Mitchell's face for judgment or resentment, but found neither. The man simply accepted what was offered without making it personal, a quality Darius envied, even as he struggled to understand it. "Let's get everyone inside before we freeze to death," Darius said, producing his keys with hands that trembled slightly from cold and nervousness. The massive front door was custom-crafted from reclaimed barnwood, another expensive detail that suddenly felt pretentious rather than tasteful. The foyer alone was larger than many people's homes, with a cathedral ceiling that soared 20 feet above polished hardwood floors. A chandelier made from antler horn cast warm light over Native American artwork that Patricia had selected for its investment potential rather than aesthetic appreciation. Everything was perfectly appointed, professionally decorated, and utterly devoid of personal warmth. The bikers filed in quietly, their boots leaving small puddles on the heated floors. Darius watched them take in their surroundings, with the careful observation of people accustomed to assessing new environments quickly. They showed no obvious envy or resentment, just the practical awareness of men who'd learned to adapt to whatever circumstances they encountered. "There's a great room through here," Darius said, leading them toward the house's heart. "Fireplace, comfortable seating, kitchens fully stocked if anyone's hungry." The great room lived up to its name, a soaring space dominated by a massive stone fireplace and furnished with leather couches that cost more than most people's cars. The far wall was entirely glass, offering views that in daylight revealed the entire valley below. Tonight, it showed only swirling snow and their own reflections looking back like ghosts. "This is temporary," Mitchell announced to his group, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. "We appreciate the hospitality, but we don't impose. Everyone stays respectful, stays grateful, and we're gone as soon as the road's clear." "Understood, Cap," came the collective response, and Darius realized he was witnessing military discipline maintained long after military service had ended. These men might look like outlaws, but they operated with a code stricter than most corporate environments. Tommy, the younger biker who'd shown frustration at the diner, wandered toward the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined one wall. His fingers traced the spines of first-edition classics and business journals with surprising reverence. "You actually read all these?" he asked Darius. "Most of them," Darius admitted. "Some are just for show, I suppose." Tommy pulled out a worn copy of The Art of War and flipped through pages that showed obvious use. "My old man made me read this when I got back from Afghanistan. Said it might help me understand what happened over there." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Afghanistan. Suddenly, the military bearing and group discipline made perfect sense. These weren't just bikers, they were veterans, men who'd served their country and returned to find themselves unwelcome. "In places like Betty's Diner, how long were you deployed?" Darius asked quietly. 3 tours, Tommy replied, still focused on the book. "Lost count of how many firefights. Came home to a country that said it supported the troops, but crossed the street when they saw us coming." Other conversations had started around the room as the bikers gradually relaxed. Darius caught fragments, discussions of shared deployments, mutual friends, the challenges of civilian life after military service. These men had found each other not through rebellion, but through a common understanding of what it meant to serve and then be forgotten. Mitchell appeared at Darius's elbow, having somehow moved across the room without making a sound. "Mind if we get that fire started? Some of the guys are still pretty cold." "Of course," Darius said, though he realized he had no idea how to operate his own fireplace. It was gas-powered with electronic ignition, controlled by a remote he rarely used. Patricia handled most of the house's daily operations through a service that maintained everything in his absence. He fumbled with the remote until flames sprang to life behind the glass screen. The effect was immediate and transformative. Warm light danced across weathered faces, and the bikers unconsciously arranged themselves in a semicircle around the hearth like humans had done for thousands of years. "Beautiful home," said an older biker with a grey beard and gentle eyes. "Must be nice to have a place like this to come home to." The comment was meant kindly, but it hit Darius like a cold slap. When was the last time this house had felt like home, rather than just an expensive storage facility for his possessions? When had he last sat by this fireplace or felt genuine warmth within these walls? "It's just a house," he found himself saying. "I'm hardly ever here." "That's a shame," the older man replied. "Place like this should be full of family, full of life. Seems lonely otherwise." The words were spoken without judgment, but they cut deep. This stranger had identified the essential emptiness of Darius's existence within minutes of entering. His home, the loneliness he'd spent decades denying, suddenly felt as obvious as the storm raging outside. The kitchen became an unexpected gathering point as the evening wore on. Despite having a professional chef's setup that intimidated even Darius, the bikers had somehow transformed it into something warm and functional. Coffee brewed in the expensive machine while someone had found bread and sandwich fixings in the oversized refrigerator. The contrast was surreal. Rough hands operating equipment worth more than most annual salaries, yet creating something more genuine than any meal the kitchen had produced in years. "Hope you don't mind us raiding your supplies," Mitchell said, appearing beside Darius with 2 steaming mugs. "We'll replace whatever we use." "Don't worry about it," Darius replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was stronger than his usual blend, prepared with the utilitarian efficiency of people who valued substance over presentation. "Most of this stuff goes bad before I get around to eating it anyway." Mitchell studied him with those penetrating eyes. "You live here alone?" "Mostly. My wife prefers the city. Claims the altitude gives her headaches." It was a lie of omission. Patricia avoided the mountain house because it represented everything she disliked about their marriage. The isolation, the distance from their social circle, the reminder that wealth couldn't fill emotional voids. She preferred their Denver penthouse, where she could maintain the fiction that they were a happy power couple, rather than 2 strangers sharing expensive real estate. "Kids?" Mitchell asked. Darius nodded toward a silver-framed photograph on the granite counter, the only personal touch in the otherwise sterile space. The image showed him with Marcus and Sarah at Sarah's college graduation 3 years ago. All 3 wore forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes, creating a portrait of familial obligation rather than affection. Mitchell picked up the frame, studying the faces with the careful attention he'd shown everything else. "Handsome family? They visit often?" "Not really." The admission came easier than expected. "Marcus lives in Seattle. Sarah's in Boston. We're all very busy." "Busy?" Mitchell repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Yeah, that's the enemy, isn't it? Being too busy for the people who matter." Before Darius could respond, a commotion arose from the great room. Raised voices, not angry but animated in a way that suggested conflict brewing. Both men hurried toward the sound, finding Tommy squared off against another biker near the entertainment center. "Think just because you've got money, everything's supposed to work for you," Tommy was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Some of us learn to fix things with our hands instead of throwing cash at problems." The object of his ire was the home theater system, a complex arrangement of screens, speakers, and components that Darius had never fully understood. The other biker, a heavy-set man with scarred hands, was examining the connection cables with professional interest. "What's the problem?" Mitchell asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that immediately diffused tension. "Rico here thinks he can fix the sound system," Tommy said. "I'm telling him it's not our place to mess with someone else's expensive toys." Rico looked up from the tangle of cables with patient amusement. 20 years as an electronics technician before I enlisted, another 10 after I got back. This is just a grounding issue, probably been bugging Mr. Holt for months. All eyes turned to Darius, who felt heat rise in his cheeks. The sound system had indeed been problematic since installation, producing intermittent static that the company's technicians had failed to resolve, despite multiple service calls, costing thousands of dollars. "You're welcome to take a look," Darius said. "If you can fix it, you'd be doing me a favor." Rico grinned and dove back into the cables with obvious enthusiasm. Within minutes, he'd identified the problem, a simple loose connection that had somehow eluded professional technicians. The system roared to life with crystal clarity, producing sound quality Darius had never heard from his own equipment. "There you go," Rico announced with quiet satisfaction. "Should work fine now." The moment crystallized something important for Darius. Here was a man whose expertise exceeded that of expensive specialists, yet he'd been dismissed by society as somehow lesser because of his appearance and associations. How many other assumptions had Darius made based on surface judgments? How much wisdom had he missed by surrounding himself only with people who looked and sounded like success? "Thank you," Darius said, meaning it deeply. "The company's been trying to fix that for 6 months. Companies like that make things complicated, because complicated is profitable," Rico replied, with the weariness of someone who dealt with such inefficiency repeatedly. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. As the evening progressed, similar revelations multiplied. The quiet man with kind eyes turned out to be a former teacher who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before returning to find his position eliminated. By budget cuts, the youngest member of the group was working toward an engineering degree while supporting his disabled mother. Another had started a small construction business that employed other veterans struggling with civilian employment. These weren't the stereotypes Darius had unconsciously absorbed from media portrayals. They were complex individuals with skills, dreams, and challenges that defied easy categorization. Many had served their country honorably, only to return home and discover that their sacrifice was honored more in speeches than in job opportunities or health care. "The weird part," Tommy was saying during a conversation about post-deployment struggles, "is coming back and realizing that most people never think about what's happening overseas. We're fighting wars they don't want to hear about, for reasons nobody can really explain. And when we come home, they act like we should just slot back into normal life like nothing happened." "What's normal?" asked the former teacher, whose name, Darius had learned, was David. "Normal for them is complaining about traffic while we're wondering why every loud noise makes us want to hit the deck. Normal for them is worrying about mortgage payments while we're trying not to think about friends who didn't make it home." The conversation was heavy with shared understanding that excluded Darius completely. He'd never served, never faced life or death situations, never had his worldview shattered by experiences that couldn't be processed through normal frameworks. His struggles were financial and strategic, important but fundamentally different from the existential challenges these men had faced. "I never served," Darius said quietly, not sure why he felt compelled to acknowledge the obvious. "I don't think I really understand what you went through." "No reason you should," Mitchell replied without judgment. "Different people serve in different ways. You built something, created jobs, contributed to the economy. That matters too. But did it?" Sitting among these men who'd risked everything for principles larger than themselves, Darius found himself questioning the value of his contributions. He'd optimized human resources, maximized shareholder value, and accumulated wealth with ruthless efficiency. But had he actually served anyone beyond himself and his investors? His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Storm on the news. Hope you're somewhere safe. Don't forget the board call tomorrow." The message was practical, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. She was concerned about his safety in the same way she might worry about valuable property, not from love, but from investment protection. He looked around the room at men who'd chosen brotherhood over individual advancement, service over personal gain, loyalty over efficiency. They'd found meaning in connections that couldn't be quantified or optimized. They'd created bonds that survived combat, deployment, and the challenges of civilian life. When was the last time anyone had shown genuine concern for Darius as a person, rather than as a business asset? When had he last felt the kind of unconditional loyalty these men showed each other? His relationships were transactional, profitable, strategic, and ultimately hollow. The storm outside continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the great room, something warmer was taking shape. Not friendship exactly. That would take time and shared experience, but recognition. These men were teaching him something he'd forgotten how to learn, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased, optimized, or controlled. They had to be earned through vulnerability, service, and genuine care for others. As the night deepened and conversations continued around the fireplace, Darius realized he was receiving an education more valuable than his MBA, more practical than any corporate training, and more honest than anything he'd learned in boardrooms filled with people who smiled while calculating how to use each other for advantage. Past midnight, the great room had settled into smaller conversations as exhaustion began to claim some of the group. Several bikers dozed in the oversized chairs, while others maintained quiet discussions near the fireplace. The storm continued its relentless assault outside, but the house felt like a warm island of unexpected fellowship, floating in a sea of chaos. Darius found himself drawn into a conversation with Mitchell and David, the former teacher, who'd been sharing stories about their deployment together in Kandahar province. What started as military reminiscences had gradually evolved into something more philosophical, a meditation on service, sacrifice, and the disconnect between civilian and veteran experiences. The hardest part wasn't the combat, David was saying, his fingers unconsciously turning what appeared to be a small military compass he'd produced from his pocket. It was coming home and realizing that the country we'd been fighting for had moved on without us, like we'd been playing a game where the rules changed while we were overseas. Mitchell nodded with the understanding of shared experience. Veteran services are a joke. Healthcare system treats us like broken equipment that needs fixing, rather than human beings who need support. And don't get me started on job placement programs. Darius felt an uncomfortable stirring in his chest. What kinds of problems with job placement? Where do we start? Mitchell's laugh held no humor. Most companies want veterans on paper. Looks good for their diversity initiatives and government contracts. But they don't want the reality of hiring people who might have PTSD, who learned leadership in life or death situations, who question authority when it doesn't make sense. Plus, David added, we're trained to solve problems and accomplish missions, not to navigate corporate politics and bureaucratic nonsense. We're used to direct communication, clear objectives, and accountability for results. Most corporate environments reward the opposite. The words hit Darius like physical blows. Holt Tech had been built on algorithms that screened out problematic candidates, applicants with gaps in employment history, psychological treatment records, or non-traditional career paths. His company had perfected the art of identifying and eliminating exactly the kind of people sitting in his living room. My company, he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. We develop HR software for Fortune 500 companies, applicant screening, performance optimization, workforce analytics. Mitchell studied him with new interest. What kind of screening? Darius felt heat rise in his neck. Predictive analytics. We help companies identify candidates most likely to succeed, based on historical data patterns, educational backgrounds, employment stability, psychological profiles. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These men had just described being systematically excluded from employment opportunities, and Darius had admitted to perfecting the systems that excluded them. So, you're the guy, Tommy said from across the room, his voice cutting through conversations like a blade. Apparently, their discussion had drawn wider attention. You're one of the people who make sure guys like us never get hired." "It's not that simple," Darius protested, though even as he spoke he knew it was exactly that simple. "We're just optimizing efficiency, reducing hiring risks, improving retention rates." "Reducing risks," Rico repeated slowly. "Like the risk of hiring a veteran who might actually give a damn about the job instead of playing political games." The room had grown quiet now, 15 pairs of eyes focused on Darius with varying degrees of understanding and judgment. He felt exposed in a way that boardroom confrontations had never prepared him for, stripped of his usual defenses and forced to confront the human cost of his algorithms. "Here's what your efficiency looks like from our side," David said, his teacher's voice patient but relentless. "I spent 6 years in the classroom before deploying, earned a master's degree in education, served 2 tours training Afghan police of forces, and came home to find that a 3-month gap in my employment history flagged me as high risk in every application system I encountered." "Same here," added another voice. 20 years as a mechanic, 4 tours maintaining vehicles in combat zones, came home with skills that could fix anything with an engine. But because I'd been treated for anxiety, which any rational person would have after getting blown up twice, your algorithms marked me as psychologically unstable." Darius wanted to argue that the systems weren't designed to discriminate, that they simply identified patterns and probabilities. But sitting among the human beings those patterns had excluded, such arguments felt hollow and inadequate. These weren't statistics or data points. They were men who'd served their country and been discarded by the very society they'd protected. "I never thought about it from that perspective," he admitted quietly. "Of course you didn't," Tommy said, his voice sharp with accumulated frustration. "Why would you? Your system works perfectly for people like you, people who never served, never sacrificed, never had their lives interrupted by something bigger than their career plans." Mitchell held up a hand before Darius could respond. "Easy, Tommy. Man's being honest, and that's more than most people in his position would do." The compass in David's hand caught the firelight as he turned it slowly. "You know what this is?" he asked Darius. "Military compass?" "My grandfather's. He carried it through 3 Pacific campaigns in World War II. My father carried it through Vietnam. I carried it through Iraq and Afghanistan." David's thumb traced the worn metal surface with obvious reverence. "Know what it taught me?" Darius shook his head. "True north doesn't change based on circumstances. True north is constant, but most people, especially people with money and power, they lose track of true north. They start thinking success and profit are the same thing as purpose and direction." The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Darius had spent decades navigating by financial metrics and market indicators while completely losing sight of any moral compass. He'd optimized systems without considering their impact on the people those systems were supposed to serve. "What's your true north?" Mitchell asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Darius opened his mouth to answer, then realized he didn't have one. Success, money, recognition, none of those felt like north. They felt like endless circles that led nowhere meaningful. "Don't know," he said finally. "I thought it was building something important, creating value. But sitting here listening to you guys, I'm starting to think I've been moving in the wrong direction for a long time." "That's honest," David acknowledged. "And honesty's the first step toward finding your way." The conversation gradually shifted as the night wore on, but Darius remained locked in internal dialogue with uncomfortable truths. He'd spent his career creating systems that measured human worth through algorithmic filters, reducing complex individuals to data points and risk assessments. He'd eliminated the human element from human resources and called it progress. But these men represented everything his algorithms had been designed to exclude. They were unpredictable, emotionally complex, morally driven, rather than profit-motivated. They'd made sacrifices that couldn't be quantified and possessed qualities that couldn't be optimized. In other words, they were human in ways his systems couldn't process or value. Around 2 a.m., as the storm finally began to show signs of abating, Darius excused himself and walked to the kitchen for water. Through the window, he could see that snow was still falling, but with less violence than before. Dawn was still hours away, but the worst seemed to be passing. Standing alone in his expensive kitchen, surrounded by appliances he rarely used and gadgets that solved problems he didn't have, Darius felt the weight of profound loneliness. He'd built an empire based on efficiency and optimization, but he'd optimized away the very things that gave life meaning, connection, purpose, service, to something larger than himself. The bikers had found brotherhood through shared service and mutual support. They'd chosen loyalty over advancement, meaning over money, and somehow emerged from traumatic experiences with their humanity intact. Meanwhile, he'd chosen individual success over collective good and found himself isolated at the top of a mountain that suddenly felt very cold and very empty. The compass metaphor lingered in his thoughts. If true north was constant, what direction had he actually been traveling all these years? And more importantly, was it too late to change course? Dawn approached slowly, the storm's fury gradually diminishing to scattered flurries that danced against the great room's windows. Several of the bikers had claimed couches and chairs for impromptu beds, their quiet snoring creating a surprisingly domestic soundtrack. Others remained awake, maintaining the kind of informal watch rotation that suggested military habits died hard. Darius hadn't slept at all. Instead, he'd spent the dark hours walking through his own house as if seeing it for the first time, which, in many ways, he was. The mansion felt different with other people in it, their presence highlighting the sterile perfection he'd mistaken for success. Every expensive detail now seemed like evidence of misplaced priorities rather than achievement. He found himself in his study, a room he'd designed to impress visitors with its leather-bound books, antique globe, and wall of business awards. Crystal plaques and engraved honors reflected the early morning light, recognition from industry groups, chambers of commerce, and professional organizations. CEO of the Year, Innovation Leader, Workforce Optimization Pioneer. The titles that had once filled him with pride now felt hollow as campaign promises. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, moving with the silent efficiency of someone trained to observe without disturbing. His presence had become oddly comforting. During the long night, a steady anchor of competence and integrity that Darius found himself gravitating toward. Impressive collection, Mitchell observed, studying the awards with the same careful attention he'd shown everything else. "You've accomplished a lot, have I?" Darius asked, surprising himself with the question. "I mean, I've been successful by traditional measures, but listening to you guys last night got me thinking about what accomplishment actually means." Mitchell picked up one of the Crystal Awards, Excellence in Human Resource Innovation, and read the inscription aloud. "For revolutionary algorithms that transform workforce optimization and employee lifecycle management." He looked at Darius with raised eyebrows. "Employee lifecycle management? We track productivity patterns from hiring through termination," Darius explained, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with his own words. "Predictive analytics help companies identify when employees are likely to become less effective, require additional training, or represent retention risks. So you help companies figure out when to fire people before they actually do anything wrong?" The blunt translation cut deep because it was essentially accurate. Holtec's flagship product identified employees who were statistically likely to become problematic based on behavioral patterns, performance trends, and external factors. It was predictive firing dressed up in corporate language and presented as efficiency innovation. "It's more nuanced than that," Darius said weakly. "Is it?" Mitchell sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, his weathered hands folded. Calmly, "Tell me something. When you built these systems, did you ever think about the human cost? The families affected when someone gets fired based on an algorithm's prediction rather than their actual performance. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Darius had spent so many years focused on aggregate efficiency that he'd stopped considering individual impact. Numbers on spreadsheets didn't have families, mortgages, or dreams. Data points didn't. Lose sleep worrying about their children's futures. I thought I was solving problems, Darius said finally. Reducing waste, improving productivity, helping companies make better decisions. For who? Mitchell asked. Better for shareholders, maybe. Better for executives trying to cut costs, but better for the workers whose lives your algorithms control. Through the study's window, Darius could see some of the other bikers moving around the great room, folding blankets and restoring order with military precision. These men understood service, sacrifice, and taking care of each other. Meanwhile, he'd built a career on helping corporations treat employees as disposable resources to be optimized rather than human beings to be valued. You want to know something? Ironic, Mitchell continued. Half the guys out there have been screwed by systems exactly like yours. Veterans get flagged as high risk because of PTSD treatment, deployment gaps, or unconventional career paths. Your algorithms probably kept more good men unemployed than incompetent employees retained. The words hit like physical blows. Darius thought about Tommy's bitterness, Rico's technical skills being overlooked, David's teaching experience discounted because of military service. His innovations had been weapons used against the very people who deserved society's support. There's something else, Mitchell said, his voice taking on a different quality. Something I need to tell you before we leave. Something in his tone made Darius look up sharply. Mitchell's expression had changed, becoming more formal, more purposeful. Last night wasn't exactly coincidence, Mitchell continued. We weren't. Just random bikers caught in a storm. What do you mean? Mitchell reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. We've been trying to reach you for months through official channels. Letters to your office, requests for meetings, attempts to set up appointments through your company's veteran outreach program. Darius accepted the document with trembling hands. It was a letter addressed to him personally, dated 3 months earlier, requesting a meeting to discuss Holtec's hiring algorithms and their impact on veteran employment. The letterhead showed Iron Brotherhood Veterans Association, a formal organization, not the motorcycle gang he'd assumed. We're not just bikers, Mitchell explained patiently. We're a veterans advocacy group. Tommy has a law degree. Rico ran IT systems for a major defense contractor before his PTSD got him blacklisted. David was a high school principal before deployment. Most of us have advanced degrees, professional experience, and track records of service. The revelation recontextualized everything. These weren't rough outcasts society had forgotten. They were educated professionals who'd been systematically excluded by the very systems Darius had created. The leather jackets and motorcycles weren't markers of rebellion, but symbols of brotherhood among men who'd found each other after being discarded by a society that claimed to honor their service. The storm gave us an opportunity we couldn't get through normal channels, Mitchell continued. A chance to talk to you human being to human being without corporate buffers and PR handlers filtering the conversation. You planned this? We planned to be in the area when the storm hit, hoping it might create an opportunity to approach you. We didn't plan the diner or the rejection or you offering shelter. That was genuine. Darius felt the room spinning slightly. The evening's emotional journey had been real, but it had also been orchestrated by men who understood strategy and planning better than he'd given them credit for. They'd maneuvered him into exactly the situation needed to open his eyes to truths he'd been avoiding. So this was all a setup? The circumstances were engineered, Mitchell admitted. The conversations were real. Your responses were real. The problems we discussed are real. We just created a situation where you'd have to confront those realities without your usual defenses. Darius looked around his study with new eyes. The awards and accolades that had defined his identity suddenly felt like evidence in a trial, where he was both judge and defendant. These men had outmaneuvered him completely, not through deception, but through superior understanding of human psychology and strategic thinking. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "Change," Mitchell said. Simply, "Your algorithms are destroying good people's lives. We want you to see the human cost of your innovations and help us fix the system you helped create." Outside, the storm was ending, but inside the study, a different kind of tempest was just beginning. Darius realized he'd been living in a carefully constructed bubble that protected him from the consequences of his choices. These men had burst that bubble by forcing him to confront the people his systems had failed. The question now was whether he had the courage to do something about it. The folder Mitchell placed on the desk was thick with documents, photographs, and official papers that had been assembled with the methodical precision of a military operation. Darius stared at it as if it might explode, sensing that whatever lay inside would fundamentally alter his understanding of everything that had transpired. "Before you open that," Mitchell said, settling back in his chair with the calm of a man who'd carried this burden for a long time, "I need you to understand something. This isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about justice and preventing future damage." Darius opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. The first document was a military service record for Sergeant Michael Torres, Mitchell's official. Name: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 3 combat tours, exemplary service record. But it was the next page that made Darius's blood run cold. It was a Holt employment assessment report dated 18 months earlier. Mitchell's name was at the top, along with a photograph and detailed analysis of his application to a major defense contractor. Red flags marked virtually every aspect of his profile: extended employment gap due to military service, psychological treatment history, non-traditional educational pathway, leadership experience in high-stress environments. Indicates potential difficulty with civilian authority structures. The algorithmic assessment concluded with a risk rating of 8.7 out of 10, effectively blacklisting Mitchell from consideration despite his obvious qualifications. The position had been filled by a candidate with a 3.2 risk rating who possessed half of Mitchell's experience but none of his military background. This was for a job training security personnel for overseas contracts, Mitchell said quietly. "I was overqualified by any reasonable measure, but your system flagged me as too risky to hire." Darius flipped through more documents, each one revealing another veteran whose life had been derailed by Holtec's algorithms. Tommy Nguyen, law degree from Georgetown, decorated Marine, rejected for a corporate counsel position because his PTSD treatment indicated potential volatility. Rico Martinez, electronics engineering background, perfect for a technical support role, eliminated because his sporadic work history suggested unreliability. David Thompson's file was particularly damaging. The former teacher and principal had applied for an educational consulting position with a major corporation, only to be flagged as overqualified and likely to become dissatisfied based on salary. Reduction algorithms that compared his teaching salary to corporate pay scales. The system had eliminated him not for lacking qualifications, but for having too many. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Qualified veterans systematically excluded by algorithmic bias that disguised discrimination as efficiency. These weren't random casualties of an imperfect system. They were the deliberate result of parameters Darius had personally approved. "Every man in that room has been rejected by companies using your software," Mitchell continued. "Everyone of us has been reduced to risk metrics that ignore our actual qualifications, character, and potential contributions." But it was the final section of the folder that delivered the devastating blow. A photograph showed a young Marine in dress uniform, his smile bright with the confidence of someone embarking on an important mission. The name beneath read Lance Corporal James Mitchell, KIA, Afghanistan, 2019. "My son," Mitchell said simply. He was 22. Wanted to be a teacher like David here when he got out. Said he was going to change the world through education. Darius stared at the photograph, seeing Mitchell's eyes in the young man's face. The resemblance was unmistakable, as was the pride evident in every line of the formal portrait. "After his funeral, I struggled for a while," Mitchell continued. "Lost my job, went through some dark times, eventually ended up homeless for 6 months. When I finally got back on my feet, I started applying for work. That's when I discovered your system had flagged me as psychologically unstable because I'd sought grief counseling after losing my son in combat." The room felt like it was closing in around Darius. This wasn't just about employment discrimination. It was about a father who'd lost his son in service to his country, only to be punished by the very society that son had died protecting. "The really sick part," Mitchell said, his voice maintaining its calm despite the pain evident in his eyes, "is that the counseling that got me flagged, it was through a veterans program your company publicly supports. Holtec donated $2 million to veterans' mental health initiatives, then used participation in those programs as a reason to exclude veterans from employment." The hypocrisy was staggering. Darius remembered the press release, the photo opportunity with the veterans, organization director, the positive coverage in industry publications. His company had been praised for supporting veteran mental health while simultaneously punishing veterans who sought that support. "We started digging after the first few guys got rejected," Mitchell continued. "Found out that Holtec's algorithms had flagged over 12,000 veterans as high-risk employees in the past 3 years. 12,000 men and women who served their country only to be discarded by a system that values profit over people. 12,000. The number hit Darius like a physical blow. He'd known his software was used by hundreds of companies, but he'd never calculated the aggregate impact on any specific population. 12,000 veterans whose job applications had been automatically rejected, whose families had struggled, while qualified candidates were passed over for algorithmic reasons. "That's not all," Mitchell said, producing another document. "This is the really interesting part. It was a Holtec internal memo dated 6 months earlier, discussing the development of enhanced veteran screening protocols designed to identify military personnel who might pose cultural integration challenges in corporate environments. The memo, which bore Darius's digital signature, specifically targeted veterans with combat experience, PTSD treatment history, or leadership roles that might conflict with corporate hierarchy. Darius didn't remember approving the memo, but his signature was there, authorizing the systematic exclusion of the very people society claimed to honor. The enhancement had been presented as a risk mitigation strategy, but reading it now, it was clearly institutionalized discrimination disguised as business intelligence. "You signed off on making it harder for combat veterans to find work," Mitchell said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "You took men and women who'd been willing to die for this country and decided they weren't suitable for corporate employment." The weight of realization was crushing. Darius had built his career on optimizing systems, but he'd optimized away the human element that made those systems meaningful. He'd created tools that reduced people to data points, ignoring the context, that made their stories unique and valuable. "Why didn't you just sue us?" Darius asked, grasping for some way to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. "This is clearly discriminatory. You have documentation, legal expertise." "We tried," Tommy interjected from the doorway. He'd been listening, along with several other bikers who'd gathered in the study's entrance. "Filed complaints with the EEOC, reached out to civil rights organizations, contacted employment attorneys. Know what we found out?" Darius shook his head. "Your algorithms are legally bulletproof," Tommy continued with bitter admiration. They don't explicitly discriminate based on protected class status. They use proxy variables that correlate with military service but aren't technically veteran-specific. Employment gaps, psychological treatment, non-traditional career paths, geographic mobility patterns, all legitimate business considerations that just happen to disproportionately affect veterans. It was brilliant in its cruelty. The system discriminated without technically discriminating, achieving the same result while maintaining legal protection. Darius had created a weapon of mass employment destruction that was immune to traditional civil rights challenges. So we decided to try a different approach, Mitchell said. Person-to-person communication. Give you a chance to see the human. Faces behind the statistics, understand the real-world impact of your innovations. The storm was just cover, Rico added. We've been watching your travel patterns for months, waiting for an opportunity to approach you outside your corporate environment. When we saw you were driving alone during a major weather event, we positioned ourselves to intercept. They'd outmaneuvered him completely. While he'd been operating according to corporate protocols and algorithmic logic, they'd been thinking strategically, using military planning principles to achieve an objective he never saw coming. They turned his own isolation against him, using his emotional distance from human connection as a vulnerability to exploit. What happens now? Darius asked quietly. That depends on you, Mitchell replied. We're not here to destroy your company or ruin your life. We're here to ask you to fix what you helped break. Use your influence to modify these systems. Remove the bias that's destroying good people's lives. And if I refuse? Mitchell's smile was sad but resolute. Then we go public. Every document in that folder, every rejection letter, every case of qualified veterans being excluded by your algorithms. We hold press conferences, file lawsuits, and make sure the world knows that the company claiming to support veterans is actually destroying their employment prospects. The stakes were clear. Darius could cooperate and help reform the system he'd created, or he could face public exposure that would destroy everything he'd built. But sitting in his study, surrounded by evidence of his own moral failures, he realized the choice wasn't really about consequences. It was about character. For the first time in his career, the right decision was also the most costly one. The laptop's screen cast blue light across Darius's face as he stared at the Holt Tech algorithm architecture he'd helped design 3 years earlier. The code looked different now. Not the elegant solution to human resource optimization he'd once seen, but a digital weapon that had destroyed thousands of lives with mathematical precision. Each line of programming represented a barrier erected against the very people society claimed to honor. The sun had risen fully, painting the mountain landscape in brilliant whites and golds that mocked the darkness of his discoveries. Through the study's windows, he could see the bikers moving around his property with purpose, their military bearing evident even in casual activities like clearing snow from their motorcycles and checking equipment. The core problem is here, Rico explained, pointing to a section of code that handled risk assessment calculations. He'd positioned himself at Darius's shoulder, his scarred hands surprisingly gentle on the expensive laptop's keyboard. This algorithm assigns negative weightings to any gaps in employment history, longer than 6 months, regardless of cause, which automatically penalizes anyone who deployed overseas, Tommy added from his position near the window where he'd been monitoring. The road conditions. Military service becomes a liability instead of an asset. David joined them at the desk, his teacher's instincts making him naturally suited to breaking down complex problems into understandable components. It's not just the gaps. Look at this psychological screening module. It flags anyone who's received treatment for anxiety, depression, or PTSD. Basically, anyone who was honest about needing help gets punished for seeking it. Darius scrolled through thousands of lines of code he'd once been proud of, now seeing each function as another layer of systemic discrimination. The algorithm was sophisticated enough to avoid obvious bias, while achieving the same exclusionary results through proxy variables and statistical correlations. "We built this to be predictive," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "The idea was to identify candidates most likely to succeed based on historical patterns." "Whose historical patterns?" Mitchell asked from the leather chair where he'd been studying more documents from his folder. "Successful candidates from what population? If your training data comes primarily from traditional corporate employees, then anyone with a different background, veterans, career changers, people who've overcome adversity, will automatically be flagged as anomalous." The insight was devastating in its simplicity. Holtec's algorithms had been trained on data from existing corporate hierarchies, which meant they perpetuated existing biases rather than identifying actual potential. They'd created a system that rewarded conformity and punished the kind of diverse experience that could actually benefit organizations. "Jesus," Darius whispered, scrolling through a section of code that analyzed communication patterns. "This module flags direct, assertive communication styles as potentially disruptive. Military personnel are trained to be direct and decisive, exactly what this algorithm identifies as problematic." "Now you're getting it," Rico said with grim satisfaction. "Your system doesn't just discriminate against veterans, it discriminates against veteran values. Leadership, accountability, direct communication, mission focus, loyalty to team members. All the qualities that made us effective in military service get flagged as corporate liabilities." The laptop felt hot against Darius's palms as he continued exploring the code's implications. Each discovery was worse than the last, revealing layer upon layer of subtle bias that had accumulated into systematic exclusion. His innovation hadn't just optimized hiring, it had optimized away the very qualities that made organizations stronger. "The scariest part," David observed, "is how reasonable each individual component seems. Employment gap analysis makes sense. Companies want stable employees. Psychological screening seems prudent. Nobody wants disruptive workers. Communication style assessment appears valuable. Corporate culture matters. But when you combine them all and apply them systematically, you create a machine that eliminates anyone who doesn't fit a very narrow definition of acceptable." Darius's phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the morning. Patricia asking about his safety, board members wanting confirmation for the day's meetings, his assistant trying to manage his schedule. The normal machinery of his life continued operating while he sat in his study, confronting the wreckage of his moral foundation. "I need to call my development team," he said suddenly, reaching for his phone. "Start working on modifications immediately." "Hold on," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout the long night. "Before you make any calls, we need to talk strategy. This isn't just about fixing code. It's about changing an entire system that benefits from the status quo." The warning resonated with uncomfortable truth. Holtec's algorithms were profitable precisely because they provided legal cover for discrimination that companies wanted to practice anyway. Corporate clients paid premium prices for software that eliminated problematic candidates while maintaining plausible deniability about bias. "Your board isn't going to support changes that reduce profitability," Tommy pointed out, with the analytical precision of his legal training. "And your clients aren't going to pay for software that forces them to consider candidates they'd prefer, to exclude." "So what are you suggesting?" Darius asked. "We're suggesting you think like a soldier instead of like a businessman," Mitchell replied. "In combat, you don't just identify the objective, you anticipate resistance and plan accordingly. Changing these algorithms is the objective, but achieving that goal is going to require strategic thinking about the obstacles you'll face." The shift in perspective was jarring. Darius had spent his career thinking like a corporate executive, optimizing for efficiency and profit maximization. But these men were challenging him to think like a leader, someone responsible for mission success regardless of personal cost. "Walk me through the resistance I'm likely to encounter," he said, surprised by how naturally he slipped into strategic planning mode. "First, your technical team," Rico began, ticking off obstacles on his fingers. "They built these algorithms according to specifications that prioritized certain outcomes. Changing those specifications means acknowledging that their previous work was fundamentally flawed. Second, your sales and marketing people," David continued. "They've been selling this software as a solution to corporate hiring challenges. Admitting that it discriminates against qualified candidates undermines their entire value proposition. Third, your board of directors," Tommy added. "They have fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, which means they're legally obligated to oppose changes that might reduce profitability. And finally, your clients," Mitchell concluded. "Companies that have been using your software to legally exclude veterans and other undesirable candidates won't appreciate having that capability removed." The scope of opposition was daunting. Changing the algorithms wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a comprehensive assault on business relationships, revenue streams, and corporate culture that Darius had spent decades building. "There's another problem," Darius admitted reluctantly. "Even if I wanted to make these changes immediately, I don't have unilateral authority. Major algorithm modifications require board approval, client notification, and extensive testing protocols. The process could take months or years, while more veterans get rejected by your system," Tommy said, his voice sharp with frustration. "How many qualified people get passed over while you navigate corporate bureaucracy?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Every day that passed meant more applications automatically rejected, more families struggling while qualified breadwinners were excluded from opportunities, more veterans discovering that their service to their country had made them unemployable in the society they'd protected. "What if we approached this differently?" David suggested, his teacher's mind working through alternative strategies. "Instead of trying to change the system from within, what if we exposed it from without? Public pressure has a way of accelerating corporate decision-making." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Document everything, go public with the discrimination, force Holtec to respond to external pressure instead of internal resistance." "That would destroy my company," Darius said quietly. "Maybe." "It should be destroyed," Rico replied without malice. "Maybe a company that profits from discriminating against veterans doesn't deserve to exist." The words stung because they carried the weight of moral authority. These men had sacrificed for principles larger than themselves, while Darius had built his fortune by ignoring the human cost of his innovations. If his company's existence depended on perpetuating injustice, perhaps its destruction would be a form of justice. But sitting in his study, surrounded by evidence of systemic discrimination, Darius began to see a third option, one that would require him to risk everything he'd built for the chance to build something better. "What if we did both?" he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "What if I use my position to force changes from within while you maintain pressure from without? I take the information you've gathered and present it to my board as a business risk that requires immediate attention." "They'll never buy it," Tommy protested. "Why would they see veteran discrimination as a business risk?" "Because it is a business risk," Darius replied, his mind racing through possibilities. "Potential. Lawsuits, negative publicity, government contract implications, corporate social responsibility concerns. I frame it as risk mitigation rather than moral obligation." Mitchell studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through corporate doublespeak. "You really think you can convince your board to voluntarily reduce profits for the sake of doing the right thing?" "I think I can convince them that doing the wrong thing is becoming too expensive to sustain," Darius corrected. "And if that doesn't work, then we go public and let market forces finish what moral arguments couldn't." It was a gamble with stakes, higher than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Success meant transforming Holt Tech from a tool of discrimination into a force for genuine equity. Failure meant losing everything he'd spent his life building, while potentially achieving nothing for the veterans who'd trusted him with their stories. But as he looked around the study at men who'd risked their lives for principles they believed, Darius realized that some things were worth the risk of failure. For the first time in his career, he was prepared to bet everything on doing the right thing rather than the profitable thing. The conference phone sat in the center of Darius's mahogany desk like a modern oracle, its sleek black surface reflecting the morning light streaming through the study windows. In 30 minutes, he would place the most important call of his career, one that would either transform Holt Tech into the company it should have been or destroy everything he'd spent decades building. Mitchell stood near the window, watching. The road where scattered groups of motorcycles had begun arriving throughout the morning. Word had somehow spread through veteran networks, and the Iron Brotherhood was growing from 15 men to a gathering that stretched along the mountain highway. They came in small groups, 2 or 3 bikes at a time, until nearly 100. Motorcycles lined the estate's driveway and overflow parking. Looks like reinforcements, Tommy observed from his position at the other window. Word travels fast in the veteran community when something important is happening. Darius felt his chest tighten as he watched more bikes arrive. Each new rider represented another life affected by his algorithms. Another story of qualified service members being systematically excluded from opportunities they'd earned. The visual impact was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of the human cost of his corporate decisions. "They're not here for intimidation," Mitchell said, reading Darius's expression accurately. "They're here for witness. Whatever happens in your board call, there will be people who remember this moment and hold you accountable for the promises you make." The phone conference was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, an emergency board meeting Darius had called under his authority as CEO, claiming urgent business developments that required immediate attention. His board members were expecting a typical corporate crisis, market concerns, competitive threats, or regulatory challenges. None of them anticipated a moral reckoning. "You sure about this approach?" David asked, reviewing the notes they'd prepared together. "Once you present this information to your board, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure," Darius replied, though his hands trembled slightly as he checked his watch. "If I'm going to change this company, I need to start by telling the truth to the people who govern it." Rico had positioned himself at the laptop, ready to provide technical support during the call. The evidence was overwhelming. Documentation of systematic discrimination, statistical analysis of veteran rejection rates, and specific examples of qualified candidates being excluded for algorithmic reasons that had nothing to do with job performance. At exactly 9 a.m., Darius dialed the conference number and entered his CEO access code. The familiar chimes indicated board members joining the call from their various locations. Patricia from their Denver penthouse, the other directors from corporate offices across the country. These were people he'd worked with for years, allies, in building Holt Tech's market dominance. "Good morning, everyone," Darius began, his voice steadier than he felt. "Thank you for making time on short notice. I'm calling to discuss a critical issue that poses significant risk to our company's reputation and potential legal exposure." "What kind of risk?" asked James Crawford, the board chairman and former Goldman Sachs partner who'd led Holt Tech's initial public offering. "Are we talking about regulatory action or competitive pressure?" "We're talking about systematic discrimination," Darius said, letting the words hang in the conference room air. "Our algorithms have been illegally excluding qualified veterans from employment opportunities, and we have documented evidence of the pattern." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief and concern. Patricia's voice cut through it first, sharp with the controlled panic of someone protecting valuable assets. "Darius, what exactly are you saying? Our software doesn't discriminate. It optimizes hiring decisions based on objective criteria." "The criteria aren't as objective as we thought," Darius replied, nodding to Rico, who began pulling up specific examples on the laptop screen. We've identified systematic bias against military veterans that violates federal employment law and exposes us to massive legal liability. Who's we? Crawford demanded, his investment banker instincts immediately zeroing in on the information source. Where is this supposed evidence coming from? Mitchell stepped closer to the phone, his presence somehow audible even through the electronic connection. The evidence comes from the veterans whose lives have been destroyed by your algorithms. I'm speaking to you as the representative of hundreds of qualified service members who've been systematically excluded from employment by Holt Tech software. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Board members began talking over each other, demanding explanations, questioning the legitimacy of the accusations, and expressing outrage at outsiders being included in a confidential board meeting. Darius, who authorized these people to participate. In board discussions, Patricia's voice carried the icy authority she used when corporate assets were threatened. This is highly irregular and potentially damaging to attorney-client privilege. I authorized it, Darius said firmly. As CEO, I have the responsibility to bring material business risks to the board's attention. This is a material business risk. Material business risk? Scoffed Margaret Chen, the HR consultant who'd helped design many of Holt Tech's screening algorithms. Our software is legally compliant and commercially successful. What risk could there possibly be from a handful of disgruntled job applicants? The risk, Tommy interjected, his lawyer's training evident in his precise language, is a federal class action lawsuit representing 12,000 veterans who've been illegally discriminated against by your software. The risk is congressional. Hearings about corporate discrimination against service members. The risk is criminal liability for knowingly perpetuating systematic bias in violation of federal employment law. The board's response shifted immediately from dismissive to defensive. These were people who understood legal exposure and financial liability, even if they struggled with moral obligations. That's impossible, Crawford said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Our legal team reviewed all algorithms for compliance issues. We have documentation proving non-discriminatory intent. Intent doesn't matter if the impact is discriminatory, Mitchell replied calmly, and the impact is clear. Qualified veterans are being rejected at rates that far exceed statistical probability. The pattern is so obvious that any competent lawyer could prove systematic bias in court. Darius watched the laptop screen as Rico pulled up statistical analyses that painted an undeniable picture of discrimination. Veteran rejection rates were 3 times higher than non-veteran rates for equivalent positions. Military service members were being flagged as high-risk candidates regardless of their qualifications or performance histories. Even if there are problems with the algorithms, Patricia said, her voice taking on the negotiating tone she used when trying to minimize corporate damage. Surely we can address them through software updates rather than admitting liability. The problem isn't just technical, Darius said quietly. The problem is that we built these algorithms knowing they would exclude certain populations. We created legal discrimination and called it optimization. The words fell into the conference. Call like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and concern that spread through the corporate hierarchy. For the first time in his career, Darius was telling his board uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable lies. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Patricia asked, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. This doesn't sound like you at all. Perhaps that was the most honest thing anyone had said during the call. This wasn't the Darius who'd built Holt Tech through ruthless efficiency and moral flexibility. This was someone who'd finally seen the human cost of his innovations and decided that profit wasn't worth perpetuating injustice. I'm having a moral awakening, he replied simply, and I'm asking this board to join me in doing the right thing. The board's response came like a corporate avalanche, swift, crushing, and designed to bury any threat to their carefully constructed profit structure. Crawford's voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives without considering the human cost. "Darius, I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence," he announced. "Your judgment has clearly been compromised, and you're putting the entire company at risk with these reckless accusations and unauthorized disclosures." "Seconded," Patricia said without hesitation, her business instincts overriding any personal loyalty to her husband. This conversation should never have included outside parties, and these allegations could constitute corporate sabotage if they're made public. Darius felt the familiar machinery of corporate power turning against him, the same efficient, ruthless system he'd helped create and had used countless times to eliminate obstacles and opposition. Board members who'd praised his leadership for years were now moving to remove him because he'd chosen principle over profit. "You're talking about firing the CEO for exposing illegal discrimination?" David asked, his teacher's sense of justice clearly offended by the board's priorities. "For trying to fix a system that's destroying good people's lives. We're talking about protecting our shareholders and employees from a CEO who's apparently suffered some kind of psychological break," Margaret Chen replied with clinical precision. "Mr. Holt's behavior is erratic and potentially damaging to corporate interests." Mitchell moved closer to the phone, his presence somehow commanding attention even through the electronic connection. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd led men through life-and-death situations. "Let me make something crystal clear to this board," he said. "We have documentation of systematic discrimination, statistical evidence of illegal bias, and testimony from hundreds of qualified veterans who've been excluded by your algorithms. Whether Mr. Holt remains your CEO or not, this information is going public." "Is that a threat?" Crawford demanded. "It's a fact," Tommy interjected, his legal training evident in his precise language. "We have a press conference scheduled for this afternoon. Congressional representatives who've agreed to review our findings, and multiple news organizations interested in the story. The question isn't whether this becomes public, it's whether Holt Tech chooses to be part of the solution or the target of the investigation." The board's confidence wavered as the reality of external pressure became clear. These weren't just disgruntled employees or internal dissidents. They were organized advocates with legal expertise, media connections, and political support. The corporate machinery designed to suppress internal opposition was useless against external accountability. "What exactly do you want?" Patricia asked, her negotiating instincts finally engaging with the actual situation rather than fighting. "The messenger. We want Holt Tech to acknowledge the discrimination, modify the algorithms to eliminate bias, and establish a veteran hiring initiative to address past exclusions," Mitchell replied. "We want this company to become part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem." "That could cost millions in lost revenue," Crawford protested. "Our clients pay premium prices specifically for the screening capabilities you're asking us to eliminate. Then maybe those clients need to learn how to hire based on qualifications instead of algorithmic prejudice," Rico said with the blunt honesty of someone who'd been personally affected by the system's failures. Darius watched. His board struggled with a choice that felt foreign to their corporate experience, choosing moral obligation over financial optimization. These were people who'd built their careers on maximizing profit and minimizing risk, not on considering the human cost of their decisions. "I need to know where this board stands," Darius said finally, his voice carrying new authority born from moral certainty rather than corporate hierarchy. "Are we going to fix this system voluntarily, or are we going to force these veterans to destroy us publicly?" "You're asking us to voluntarily reduce profitability for the sake of people who aren't even our customers," Margaret Chen said with obvious frustration. That violates our fiduciary duty to shareholders. No, Darius replied firmly. I'm asking us to obey federal employment law and stop profiting from illegal discrimination. That's not a violation of fiduciary duty, it's basic legal compliance. The argument hung in the conference room air like smoke, exposing the fundamental conflict between profit maximization and legal obligation that had driven Holtec's success. The board had become so focused on algorithmic efficiency that they'd lost sight of legal and moral boundaries. The vote is simple, Crawford announced with obvious reluctance. All in favor of maintaining current business practices and removing Mr. Holt as CEO, say aye. Patricia's voice came first, clear and decisive. Aye. Margaret Chen followed. Aye. Two more board members added their voices to the corporate consensus, choosing familiar profit over uncertain principle. Motion carries, Crawford said with corporate finality. Darius, you're relieved of CEO duties effective immediately. Security will escort you from company premises when you return to Denver. The words should have felt like devastating defeat. The end of everything he'd built. The destruction of his career and reputation. Instead, Darius felt something unexpected, relief. The weight of moral compromise he'd carried for years was suddenly lifted, replaced by the lighter burden of doing the right thing regardless of personal cost. Fine, he said simply, but you should know that I'm going to that press conference this afternoon, and I'm going to tell the world exactly how Holtec's algorithms work and why they're illegal. The silence that followed was heavy with shock. Board members who'd expected him to accept defeat gracefully were confronting the reality that removing him from corporate authority didn't eliminate his moral authority or his access to damaging information. Mitchell extended his hand to Darius, a gesture of respect between equals rather than supplication between unequal parties. As their hands met, Darius felt the calloused strength of someone who'd earned his authority through service rather than accumulation. Welcome to the fight, Mitchell said simply. For the first time in years, Darius felt like he belonged somewhere. That mattered. 6 months later, Darius stood in the parking lot of a small office building in Golden, Colorado, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had become his true north. The building was modest compared to Holtec's downtown Denver headquarters. Recycled brick, solar panels, a small sign reading Veteran Talent Solutions in simple, dignified lettering. But it felt more like home than any office he'd ever occupied. The morning ritual had become sacred to him. Arriving early, brewing coffee in the break room that doubled as a meeting space, reviewing resumes and job placement statistics that told stories of second chances and renewed purpose. The numbers were smaller than Holtec's massive metrics, but they measured success in human terms rather than algorithmic efficiency. Mitchell emerged from the building's entrance, carrying 2 steaming mugs and moving with the quiet confidence that had impressed Darius from their first meeting in the storm-bound diner. The partnership that had begun in crisis had evolved into something deeper, a friendship built on shared purpose and mutual respect, earned through trials that tested character rather than just competence. Busy day ahead, Mitchell observed, handing Darius one of the mugs. 3 companies coming in for algorithm consultations, and Rico's got final presentations on the bias detection software. Any word from the congressional subcommittee? Darius asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. The Senate investigation into employment discrimination had been ongoing for months, with Veteran Talent Solutions providing technical expertise and testimony that was reshaping federal hiring guidelines. Tommy's handling the briefing this afternoon. Apparently, they're impressed enough with our work to consider mandating bias audits for all federal contractors. Mitchell's smile carried the satisfaction of someone watching long-term strategy come to fruition. 12,000 veterans were discriminated against by algorithms like Holtec's. Now those same algorithms will be required to prove they don't discriminate. The irony wasn't lost on Darius. He'd spent years perfecting systems that excluded qualified candidates, and now he was building systems that ensured inclusion. The technical challenges were actually more complex. Removing bias while maintaining effectiveness required sophisticated engineering that went far beyond simple discrimination. Through the office windows, he could see David working with a client, a nervous-looking veteran in his 30s who'd been out of work for 8 months despite impressive qualifications. The sight had become routine, but never lost its impact. Every successful placement represented not just employment statistics, but restored dignity, supported families, and communities that benefited from skills that had been systematically ignored. "Patricia called yesterday," Darius mentioned casually, though the conversation had been anything but casual. "Divorce papers are finalized." Mitchell nodded with the understanding of someone who'd also lost relationships when choosing principle over profit. "How do you feel about it?" "Relieved, mostly. Turns out we'd been strangers sharing expensive real estate for years. The separation just made it official." Darius sipped his coffee, noting how the bitter honesty had become more palatable than the sweetened lies of his previous life. "She kept the penthouse and most of the financial assets. I kept the mountain house and my self-respect. Fair trade?" "More than fair." The morning quiet was interrupted by the rumble of motorcycles arriving for the weekly Veterans Breakfast, an informal gathering that had grown from a handful of Iron Brotherhood members to nearly 50 people from various military backgrounds. What had started as a support group had evolved into a networking organization that connected veterans with employers who valued their unique skills. Rico parked his Harley near the building entrance, his movements more confident than they'd been 6 months earlier. Steady employment as Veteran Talent Solutions lead technical architect had restored more than his financial stability. It had renewed his sense of purpose and professional identity. He waved as he removed his helmet, revealing the relaxed expression of someone who'd found his place in the world. "You know what's funny?" Darius said, watching more veterans arrive for the breakfast gathering. "I spent decades trying to optimize human resources, but I never understood what made humans valuable until I started working with people everyone else had optimized out." "Military service teaches you that the most valuable qualities can't be measured by algorithms," Mitchell replied. "Loyalty, integrity, willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. Those don't show up on standardized assessments." Tommy emerged from the building carrying a stack of newspapers, his law degree finally being used for justice rather than corporate protection. The headlines were familiar by now. Tech company pays $50 million settlement for veteran discrimination. Congressional hearing exposes algorithm bias. New federal guidelines mandate hiring equity. The stories that had once threatened to destroy Darius's legacy were now evidence of his redemption. Holtec's stock dropped another 12%. "Yesterday," Tommy announced with satisfaction. "Turns out investors don't appreciate companies that profit from illegal discrimination." "Any regrets?" Mitchell asked Darius, watching his expression carefully. Darius considered the question seriously. He'd lost millions in personal wealth, a marriage that had never been based on genuine affection, and a corporate position that had isolated him from meaningful human connection. In exchange, he'd gained purpose, authenticity, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than transactional benefit. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret waiting so long to do the right thing." The veterans' breakfast was beginning inside, filling the modest conference room with voices that carried the easy camaraderie of people who'd found their tribe. These men and women had taught Darius that success couldn't be optimized or algorithmically determined. It had to be earned through service, sacrifice, and commitment to principles larger than personal advancement. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, his daughter. "Saw your interview on 60 Minutes last night. Dad, I'm proud of you. Can we have dinner this weekend?" The message represented something more valuable than any corporate award. the restoration of family relationships that had been casualties of his pursuit of empty achievement. As Mitchell headed inside to join the breakfast gathering, Darius remained in the parking lot for a few more minutes, watching the sun climb higher over peaks that no longer seemed like barriers, but like beacons pointing toward possibilities he'd never imagined. The storm that had stranded him with 15 bikers had been the beginning of a journey that led him home to himself. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful CEO who measured worth in profit margins and market dominance. Today, he was something more valuable. A man who'd learned that true north wasn't found in corporate hierarchies or algorithmic efficiency, but in the simple act of using his talents to serve others rather than himself. The transformation was complete, but the mission was just beginning. There were thousands more veterans whose talents had been overlooked, hundreds more companies that needed to learn how to value character over conformity, and countless opportunities to prove that doing the right thing wasn't just morally necessary, it was also the most effective way to build something that would last. As he walked toward the building where his real work waited, Darius felt the mountain air fill his lungs with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine when success was measured by everything except what actually mattered.